Glenn Barclay. I'm one of the National Secretaries of the PSA and really pleased to welcome you here today. It's great to see so many of you, so many indeed. We had to change our venue. We were used to hosting these at the PSA, but we're really pleased that, that St Andrews was available. Today you'll hear from John Everest on how a restorative approach might help with workplace issues. We spend most of our waking lives at work, and so workplace culture and the way things are dealt with at work can have a significant impact on our health and well-being and on our ability to do our job well. The starting point for the PSA is that at work we're treated with dignity and respect, and that employers work with us and take active steps to create positive workplaces. And our experience is that this is not always the case. So we're interested in finding better ways to make this happen. And as part of this, we're very pleased to have John here with us today, who will ask the question, how can restorative approaches help with workplace issues? John is Senior Consultant at the Chair of Restorative Justice at Victoria University of Wellington. He is an experienced conflict resolution specialist and an accredited mediator, trainer, facilitator and conflict coach who specialises in restorative processes. And I would like to introduce John and Mo.
Glenn, thank you. Kirsten, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak. I have to say, when Glenn invited me to speak today and asked to come for a lunchtime session, I envisaged what at Vic they call a brown paper bag lunch with sort of half a dozen people in a room. So it's kind of overawing to see so many people here to talk about this important topic. So thank you for being here and for giving up your kind of lunch break to be here. Just a little bit about myself, which kind of I think is probably important in terms of background, in terms of where I come from and how I approach this. My first career was actually in policing in the UK and in the Royal Hong Kong Police. Following that, went off and did my master's in the area of crime and violence within organisations. And that took me then down a journey into dispute resolution around what is it that would start making a difference within organisations. So for the last sort of 20 years or so, I've been working in conflict resolution in various guises. I provided an external mediation conflict resolution service to the university community as an independent for something like the last 15 years. Spent quite a bit of time running stopping violence programs through the court processes. And over the last 15 years, spent a lot of time in restorative justice as it started from the court-based pilot in about 2001 through where we are now, where there's restorative justice right across sort of the criminal courts in New Zealand. And so I've been working in that area first in sort of the standard criminal matters, but extending that laterally out into family violence and sexual violence. I suppose for me, having done a lot of that work and having worked as well as a workplace mediator, it seems to me at times there's a missing link. Why aren't we using some of the skills and the philosophy that goes with restorative processes in those workplace contexts? And part of my thinking is around, how a restorative process might be different to a standard mediation, as mediation has become in our system at the moment. And I should also add, probably the most important part of my sort of backstory is I'm married with 4 stepchildren, 3 of whom are daughters and 3 of whom are now in the working world. So I have a self-confessed sort of blind spot, having been brought up in a boys' boarding school between the age of 8 and 18 and then gone through 2 police forces. But that blind spot has been well and truly rectified by 3 daughters growing up and now entering the working world. And not always in ways that are easy to understand and take. To hear their stories of going into the workplace. I think of our youngest, who's a professional engineer, to hear her stories of trying to cut it in a sort of industrial landscape as a process chemical engineer is quite horrifying. And it was a world I simply didn't know. So I just need to accept my naivety and my kind of growing work and accept understanding of that. I also want to put a caveat around today. I do not believe there are simple answers to the issues that I think we're hearing a lot of over the last couple of years. It's really good to hear that the debate is feeling so current enough to gather yourselves for an audience like this. But I'm not here to say, oh, there's a simple answer to this, all we need to do is X. But I do passionately believe, and I think you'll gather as I go through, that a restorative approach fundamentally has a place and is a core sitting that I think needs to be at the heart of how we think about really creating safe workplaces, and I mean safe in the widest possible sense of that word. So in terms of looking at that complexity, a colleague of mine several years ago, a guy called Colin McKenzie, developed what he talked about as a conflict-competent organisation. Now I'm not going to go through that in detail. Safe to say that what he was talking about was taking a systems view of what goes on within organisation, and it feels to me that we need to be doing that to sort of start allowing for some of the complexity. But often what I see in organisations is something bad goes wrong and we have an adverse outcome, and organisations typically jump back simply to the behaviours and say, you know, who did it, how do we need to punish them, or how do we need to train them, and that sorts it out. And of course what it seems to me that misses out on is what sits behind that in terms of the systems, the strategies of the organisation, and further back, actually the culture of the organisation. The culture of organisation meaning kind of the behaviours around how people treat each other around here. The fact is that the culture of an organisation does drive what goes on in terms of the behaviour. It defines what is acceptable and what isn't acceptable, and even how we start thinking about these issues. And so I think we need to be going back to getting away from the situational and back to looking at it and say, actually, what's going on overall in this system? So starting to think about a sort of a definition of culture, what do we mean? And there's all sorts of academic definitions of what culture might mean in a workplace sense. And while I reside in an academic institution, I'm no academic and don't profess to be. But I like the very simple one that's provided by a woman called Michelle LeBaron in her book, Conflict Across Cultures. And she talks about culture as being the water fish swim in. And that to me kind of helps, because when we're starting to think about, you know, your organisation, what's the water like in your organisation? Is it the clear Barney sands of Itataki, taken a few years ago in our respite from conflict resolving? Or does it look a wee bit more like this? The sort of the toxic swamp with all sort of toxins in there, where you know it's very difficult to survive. I've been into a lot of organisations, and sadly, I'm very often glad to be walking out the door thinking, thank the Lord I'm not part of that organisation, because often there are toxic organisations. And not because there aren't good people, but it's the kind of the collective that emerges out of being within a particular structure. And it strikes me, particularly in Wellington, when we're very close to the sort of political environment, those pressures become even greater. So that's the background of which you all know. Let's talk about restorative approach and what that actually means. So Professor Chris Marshall, who is the chair of Restorative Justice at Victoria University, the inaugural chair there, provides this definition. And there's various ones, but I think this gives a good one in terms of workplace restorative approaches. So restorative justice refers to a relational way of responding to wrongdoing and conflict that seeks, above all else, to repair the harm suffered, and to do so where possible by actively involving the affected parties in facilitated dialogue and decision making about their needs and obligations, and how to bring about positive change for all involved. So that is the kind of goal, and I want to spend a wee bit of time just breaking that down into sort of looking at, okay, what does that actually mean, and what are the principles that we can break out of that sort of rather wordy paragraph. A restorative lens, and this comes from the work of Howard Zehr, whose book Changing Lenses, I guess written in late 80s, was kind of the first person that really started looking at restorative approaches through a sort of an academic type lens. But a restorative approach, first and foremost, focuses on harms. What is the harm that's been caused here in this situation? and what are therefore the needs of all participants. And all really meaning all, it's not just the person most directly affected, but it's actually how do we get back to a state of sort of harmony within our workplace and taking care of all parties within that. It addresses the obligations that result from those harms. So basically saying, John, if I cause a harm to someone, it's then saying I've got an obligation to do something about that in an active sense of doing something about putting that right. That it should use inclusive and collaborative processes. That it involves those with a stake in the situation. And I guess this to me is a significant change from what I see a lot going on in workplaces, where often these things are done in secret with limited parties and identified legal parties, rather than actually who is affected by what has gone on in a particular situation. And I'll come back to that as we go through. And then the focus of activity is to seek to put right the harms that have been caused. In other words, a focus on getting back to a healthy situation rather than an obsession with sort of kind of a punitive sort of obsession, which can often come in and certainly has become mirrored by our legal system. So the key restorative principles, I guess, that I'd want to sort of take away would be, it is about inclusive decision making. It's not about people making decisions on behalf of others and doing things onto others. It is about including as a group and looking, I guess, on your staff as a community and saying who in this community is involved, who's been impacted, who therefore needs to be part of the solution. It is about active accountability. And again, I'll touch on this more, but it's about people fronting up and taking responsibility for their own behaviours. And by that, I don't mean fronting up and going to court and being told what to do by a judge or the equivalent of that that's mimicked in a sort of internal discipline sort of system. It is about people taking responsibility for their own behaviours and doing what they need to put that right. And I'll expand on that later on. And with a focus on repairing the harm that's been caused, and acknowledging that that's often not just the person most directly involved, often there's a ripple effect. And certainly when I've gone into organisations, very often there's a group of staff that are badly affected, and often they're totally ignored in the process because of the fact that it becomes sort of highly confidential, privacy considerations, but actually everyone knows what's going on or has some version of what's going on. And that just leads to unhealthy rumours, and very often it just means it's not addressed, and it sits and it festers there, and it just becomes part of the ongoing narrative that sits there within the organisation. And then finally, the notion of rebuilding trust. And this is kind of very topical for you as PSA members. You know, when there's been industrial action and so on, the concept of how do we start rebuilding trust in a relationship becomes absolutely crucial. So it's probably useful at this point just to sort of detour slightly and go back and look at, you know, when we're offering up restorative, what are we offering that against, and what's the status quo? And the status quo is the sort of the conventional legal system, and there's a bunch of, and I'll make these slides available through Kirsten, so I'll be sending them out to you later on if you want them, so you don't feel you need to take frantic notes this afternoon. But just, you know, some of the key features of that conventional justice system. First off, it's adversarial. It's competitive, we're in the trenches, and it's a black and white outcome. One of us is going to win, one of us is going to lose, and it's effectively a fight to the death in that sense. Very, very dominated by professionals. Professionals are the key actors, particularly as things start escalating, with often the lawyers there, and with the direct parties having very little voice or say in what's happening. Relationships are often totally ignored. I've seen many investigations and the results of investigations. I've yet to see one of them that's actually improved workplace relationships as a result. They may have reached some decision. Very often you've got the same players remaining in place thereafter. The big question is, what the hell do we do now? That's just yet another nail into that sort of toxic swamp that we talked about at the start. And the focus gets focused very much on one individual, and it's easy to castigate one individual. And I'm not trying to say let those off the hook, but it becomes obsessed around this is a rogue person, and if we can only root out this rogue person, all will be sweetness and light in our kingdom. Questionable. So the alternative sort of restorative sort of approaches, and I'm not going through all of these, But first off, this ultimately needs to be a dialogical sort of process where there's discussion, there's opportunities to speak, where the parties, the people most affected, the people who are part of the whole sort of drama that's got to go on, are the key participants, rather than professional advocates acting on their behalf. Where our fundamental task, our key thing, is around relationships being central, around saying, how are we going to make sure and get back to a point where we can function in a healthy way as an organisation, and therefore achieve our mission as an organisation and as individuals. And that part of that therefore needs to be, rather than focusing on the wrongdoer behaviour, focusing on the impacts of that behaviour, because that is what the person needs to do to put that right, is to understand what have been the impacts here and what is needed to move us forward. So flowing out of that sort of analysis, there's kind of different sets of questions that got looked at. So through the conventional justice question, what it asked a pretty simple set of questions. What law has been broken? Who did it? How should they be punished? Pretty simple questions, and it becomes an issue of kind of just going after that, and if we do answer that, then we've done our business. And I think I've already said enough about my opinion of where we actually get to after that sort of process. A restorative process takes a different sort of lens. And the key questions might alternately be, actually, what's happened? And understanding that what has happened here there's not one story of that. And actually, we need to hear the different perspectives of everyone that's been affected by that. So, who was affected by this? And then the key question, what can be done to repair the harms and make things right? Now, this is not, and I want to make this clear, this is not about going soft on poor behaviour. It is about saying, how do we actually put the people, the person who have been affected and harmed, how do we make sure that their needs are met? And I've got to say, for all that the conventional system purports to do that, it's rarely the case, certainly as I see it in the work that I do, where often I've been coming in after there's been some sort of investigation and you're trying to mop up the pieces. And it's a heck of a long road to rebuild a culture of trust within an organisation. So the underlying assumptions that sit underneath this are around relationships, that relationships shape behaviour and shape the type of organisation that you're in, that everyone wants to feel respected and wants to feel that they belong and that they feel valued in the work that they do, that everyone is responsible for their own action. And I've got to say, having done a lot of this work in the criminal context, and right at the worst end of the scale, sitting down with a murderer, facing off with the mother whose boy he had murdered. When you sit in that environment and you can see what goes on in that type of encounter, there's huge potential for people to step up and take responsibility. And finally then, what can be done to repair the harm? And only a commitment to repair overcomes resentment and starts restoring relationships. So I want to kind of take you beyond the sort of philosophy and the assumptions and stuff to actually get down into some of the sort of what does restorative process actually look like and what might it look like. Interestingly, I was asked recently by an HR manager, could I give a brief of the process? And unfortunately, I was probably failed in my task because I said, it depends on what the situation is. This is not about coming up with a prescriptive process where we go through steps 1 to 20. It's about context. It's about looking at what's happened, what has gone on, what is going to be needed to put it right. But I want to kind of lift the bonnet a little bit to kind of give you a flavour of the sort of things that it might involve. And I'm happy to take questions later, once I've gone through some of that. So, if we take restorative process, a restorative process sits at this crossroads. We're sitting in the present, and yes, we want to move towards the future, but unless we look back to the past and understand what has happened, until we understand what the impacts have been, we are not going to be able to move forward and face the future and be able to take those lessons and learn from them. And I suppose that is kind of, in some ways, that timeline captures importantly how a restorative process works. It's going to start by looking backwards to the what happened bit, to the impacts of that, to how people have felt, to people's account of it, and using that not to apportion blame, not to decide who did it and who's at fault, but to actually pick up the wisdom so that we can start facing the future and doing something different, and repairing what's happened there. So I guess our goal is about rebuilding the implicit social contract through addressing the issues and developing a joint plan for returning to a productive workplace. So in terms of starting to think about a restorative process, these are the sort of key questions that would be offered up by Howard there around starting to think about how you might put that process together in different contexts. Starting off with who's been hurt. And often that spreads wider than we think, and we probably need to map actually, where has this gone? Who's been affected? Coming back, what are their needs? So putting them right at the center of everything we do. Whose obligations are these? Now in a workplace, clearly the employer has obligations around that. Certainly the person that's caused the person or people that have caused the harm have obligations. Actually, but often, in my experience, the wider kind of community, in other words, the work colleagues, also have some obligations in that. And whether that's acts of commission or acts of omission, it doesn't much matter. We actually need to do that for people collectively to front up and say, what can we do? What did we know about this? What could we have acted on earlier to actually call some of this behaviour? So that's asking who has a stake in the situation. Now, often the legal fraternity gets quite anxious about this question because it does certainly widen things out. But the reality is, as I alluded to before, if we reduce this to, in a bullying case, to a bully and the person who is bullied, actually that is probably not going to be a productive conversation. The reality is there'll be a bunch of people that will know pieces of the story that need to be part of that conversation, and because they can be part of the solution going forward. And so then we're asking the question, given all these, what is the appropriate process to involve stakeholders in an effort to put things right? So it's always kind of, and coming back to, I think, some of the language you'll be using these days around co-design. We're negotiating the process, we're designing it around a particular set of circumstances to meet the needs of the key parties. So a restorative intervention then aims for facilitated, respectful conversation between the primary parties. And I'll come back to that in a bit more, because certainly when we're starting to talk about sexual harassment, I can imagine, and certainly hearing my daughters talk, some major alarm bells ringing there. So I do want to come back and kind of qualify that in a moment. Is voluntary. Now, voluntariness takes on many different sort of angles. And I guess I question very often how voluntary some of these processes are. But I think the point is important, that people are not ordered to take part in them. Clearly there are pressures on people in terms of putting right, and frankly self-interest is always going to sit there as part of the equation. But at some level, people are agreeing to enter into the process. It involves careful preparation. This is not just about lobbing people into a room and say, come on, sort it out, folks. It's not that. And I think the amount of hours I spend working with people ahead of a facilitated meeting is incredibly high. I'm not going to be going into that sort of a meeting until I've had a conversation with everyone who will be attending. And everyone who's attending will know who's going to be there as well. So that takes careful preparation. Can be done singly, can be done in groups, but it's about engagement first and making sure that everyone's coming together with the right understanding and intent for the process. It does include everyone for whom the issue matters. It's focusing on harms and needs. It needs to be a process that gives full opportunity for storytelling. In other words, allow people to tell their account of what's happened and how it's affected them. That's really important, as I'll talk later on, in terms of meeting people's emotional and psychological needs. To have your story told, or be able to tell your story, and to have it listened to without interruption, I think is imperative. That it clarifies accountabilities in terms of who's got the accountabilities here and what are they going to do to enact on those. And it is empowering parties to reach agreed resolution. Now, again, we need to be careful about this in an employment context. Clearly, it sits there within a legislative sort of framework. but it's been clear of what the sort of the promise is, and it's very much about the practical around what are we going to do to put this work group right, and to more importantly to put the person at the centre of it who's been harmed in a position where they're feeling safe to return to work. One of the processes, and it's not the exclusive process that we would use, would be a circle process. And a circle process, very, very simply, is an open circle of chairs without furniture, with a nominated talking piece, which confers on everyone uninterrupted speaking rights. And a facilitator would ask a question, everyone in turn in the room would then respond to that question without interruption. And so that's generally what we talk about when we talk about a circle process. And I'll talk more later as I move through. And of course, what it's talking about is where you're putting effectively the problem rather than the person in the centre of that circle. And it's kind of moving into almost much more of a collective problem solving. And so that circle process, and this is a quote from Kay Pranis, who a big practitioner of this up in North America, that the circle itself is a ritual that communicates meaning. Sitting in the round says that everyone is included equally without regard to rank, status or hierarchy. Now, this may sound very simple. I think that it is simple, and that's why it's kind of useful, but it's profound in terms of the impact it has on the types of conversations that people might have in the workplace. So a restorative inquiry would kind of be working through these sorts of questions, allowing everyone to talk about what happened, what impact has it had on people, and that will be different for everyone. How can things be repaired and made right? How can we prevent reoccurrence? And of course, that is the crucial bit, is how do we make sure that this is not going to happen again, certainly with this group of individuals. I often liken it to a kind of a collective jigsaw exercise, where all of us have been dealt a few pieces of the jigsaw, and it's actually only when we engage in that collective conversation that the full picture starts emerging, or a clearer picture starts emerging. So often within a thing we might start off by doing some sort of connecting at a relational level, and what this is doing is getting people, we're not going straight into the heart of the matter, we're not going straight into the eye of the storm, but it's just asking the contextual questions, and questions that people can answer easily because it's the factual stuff. You know, how did you come to be working together? What are your hopes when you started this employment relationship? What's the best part of working for this organisation? And, you know, sharing strengths in terms of, you know, and I guess it's that sort of sharing the kitty and saying, how do we share and what can we all contribute to putting this right? An effective restorative process, I argue, is very much about like peeling back the layers of an onion. And the uninterrupted responding to the questions allow us to take away one layer at a time. And it becomes quite a different conversation to the one you might get in other types of process. And so then we're exploring, you know, what happened, asking everyone for their experience of this, how it's affected them, what's been the hardest thing about this for you. You know, that's quite a powerful question. Sounds very simple, but sometimes when this story is this big, to have to start distilling it down can often have a profound shift on starting to focus that conversation. And asking what's still left over for you, because that's the stuff that we need to go in and try and fix. It is about inviting responsibility and accountability. It's a key part of a restorative conversation. And I think it's trying to move us away from the finger pointing and blame to one of accountability and responsibility. So we're asking everyone, what is your contribution? What might you have contributed to how this? And it may just be a little piece, but again, in my experience, it's often multiple parties have contributed, whether it's the manager that kind of knew things weren't running well in the group, but was just too busy themselves to be able to go and spend the time and investing the time at an earlier point. You know, so it's kind of getting that out from everyone involved. So how might you have contributed to this? With hindsight, what could you have done differently? What can you do to make the situation better? What are you prepared to offer to do that? What can you do to repair the harm and make sure it doesn't happen again? So it's digging underneath that. And restorative outcomes come in a number of different levels. There's, you know, emotional and moral outcomes. The sort of first off, being kind of heard, it being acknowledge the story of the person that's been harmed, and it might, doesn't always, might lead to an apology. in terms of and a sort of an outward acceptance that acted wrongly. It might be about material outcomes, which is often the focus of our sort of mediation through NB, which is really often about the sort of material outcomes. It might be some element of compensation, for instance. And as I mentioned already, those preventative outcomes, which is the future focus bit, which is saying, how do we make sure we don't get here again? One of the things I think an effective restorative process would be doing is thinking about scaffolding the relationship, understanding that when big traumatic events have happened, it's going to take some support, some structure to actually rebuild the relationship and get it back on track, including coming back and doing a check-in. So looking on this sort of a process, not as a sort of one-off activities where we say, yep, done, sorted. It's rarely going to be sorted after one meeting. It's going to say, what are the next check-in points? And that helps the people that have been harmed to know, yep, I'm not being abandoned here. I'm not being set up and left just to sort it out. So we'd be agreeing and clarifying future expectations, including the sort of the follow-up needed, and the follow-up needed at all levels. And I think the role of other staff members who may not be directly involved, but are the bystanders or the observers, they become part of the process going forward. So I would argue that a restorative circle process can be used and can be a kind of a key ingredient of, I guess, kind of healthy team and healthy culture within an organisation. You know, it's starting throughout the employment relationship from the start, welcoming new team members into a workplace, running regular team meetings and check-ins, briefing on a new project, reviewing how a project went, discussing proposed changes in the workplace. Addressing friction or conflict as it arises, debriefing the team after difficult or traumatic events. My point is, this can become something as a structure, as a vehicle for having all of these sorts of conversations, so that when something really bad happens, you've actually already got the structure there. It's part of the culture, it's part of the DNA. So I imagine often I get at this point people pushing back and say, well, how's this different to typical workplace mediation? So I just want to run through quickly how I believe this is different. And I say this having been a mediator and done this work, but typically a mediation goes on in secret. It's going on in closed doors, and probably everyone in the work group knows that this conversation is happening, probably doesn't know the details, but of course that leaves a bunch of unanswered questions. Often there's a sense in organisations of, actually this is what we're doing. It's just, kind of dealing with it, sweeping it under the carpet, but we're not really getting to the heart of the issue. It's just out of sight, out of mind. I think an effective restorative process is much more like this. It's putting a whacking great searchlight on it and saying, actually what's happening? And it's being witnessed by recruiting in a wider group of people, so that becomes the conscience going forward, because it's not something that's been done in secret. There is an ability to hold people to account going forward. In mediation, often it's this, a mediator and two parties, perhaps legally represented. A restorative process might look much wider. Again, we're asking that wider question. Mediators can be, sounds very dodgy, as sort of corridor shufflers, but ferrying between parties, where the parties aren't directly we're negotiating some sort of settlement. And lots of cosy conversations with the likes of Everest, with parties which are always very civilised, but don't get us to the heart of what's actually gone on here, because I wasn't there and I'm not going to be there in the future. Often the focus is on settlement, getting to a point where we can sign something off, and you know, whether that has some sort of level of compensation. Whereas I think a restorative process is much more, and this is, by the way, just designed to be kind of a healthy team. It's about rebuilding teams, it's rebuilding relationships. It's about getting the workplace back to a healthy, functioning state. So Chris Marshall has talked about, built a model. We always seem to go for triangles, but a restorative organisation. And I've talked to the base of that already, which is the kind of the culture piece, the way we do things around here, or the water the fish swim in. I think it's clear, and I hope I've sort of captured the value of a restorative process in the conflict area and resolving disputes between colleagues. We'd also argue that it has a place in the complaints area, and there's a number of options for where this might take place. Sometimes it is the only thing to do, and we need to do a formal investigative and followed by a disciplinary process. Things are so severe, and by the way, that's what the complainant wants and needs. Yep, we're going to have to do that. I think part of our contention would be, and this came out last year with a piece of work I did, but someone told me, well, you know, if you're unconfident as an ops manager or as an HR manager and you receive a complaint, the best way to cover yourself is to run an investigation. Oh, and by the way, the least likely way of solving it is to run an investigation. You know, so that's often what people get kind of caught in. So there's definitely a place for it. I would just say be cautious about jumping there too quickly. Sometimes an informal restorative process is sufficient, particularly if someone is actually acknowledging what they did. That allows us to move into a different sort of process where it's focused in a restorative way in the way that I've outlined here this morning. And sometimes there's room for a supplementary restorative process after the investigation or alongside the investigation. So to ensure that the victim, the person that's been harmed, that their voices and needs are acknowledged, often they get missed out. The biggest thing that I often hear from complainants is I put my complaint in, I haven't heard anything for 3 months, 6 months, and I just didn't feel respected in the way the process was run. It allows the opportunity to run a restorative process to address the indirect impact on a team. Often the team are hugely impacted by these sorts of events, and they're left there kind of thinking, what do we do now? X has now left the organisation, but we're still with the status quo, and to give them some sort of voice in that process. And the other part is where people are returning to work on whichever side of that equation to facilitate subsequent reintegration of those people into the workplace. Now, I'm really conscious that you know, a lot of the framing so far has been about this kind of direct conversation and encounter, and I recognise particularly with sort of sexual harassment type matters, that might not be appropriate for all sorts of reasons. Now, we had Professor David Karp over from the States last year, who's been doing a lot of work in North American university campuses, looking at alternates to that. And experimenting with these things. Now, I'm not saying this is an exhaustive list, but what I am saying is we need to be more creative, based on restorative principles, to sort of support people getting their needs met. So that might be kind of some sort of video conferencing, because they don't want to be in the same room, and it's not safe for them to be in the same room. They've used video exchanges, and that has actually become sometimes the forerunner to a direct meeting. Sometimes there may be some sort of written exchange, the sharing of a sort of victim impact statement. Sometimes surrogate participation, you know, where other people who have been affected by that sort of behaviour talk to the person that's been causing the harm and actually let them know what it's been like and how disempowering and how wretched it is for their whole life. And also running things like victim support circles where, you know, where there's an empathetic sort of group of people who are there to support and acknowledge what's happened. Now, all of these are restorative interventions, so please get away from the notion that this is about the sort of victim-offender encounter. It doesn't have to be. There's lots of ways of meeting people's needs, and we just need to be creative. I'm just about into injury time because I do want to leave some time for questions. In terms of thinking about preparing your organisation, what can you do? I think there's a few things you can do, and I think first off that needs to start off by asking yourselves the honest question. What behaviours are encouraged by your current systems and structures for managing conflict? Now, what I see a lot in organisations, and I know this is not intended, but it simply becomes an escalation pathway. And it escalates pretty damn quickly, and very quickly it's out of control. And there's often not a bunch of really good choices for people to make. So I think we need to ask ourselves the honest question about where are we now, because that's the forerunner to actually starting to make a difference. So how can an organisation support restorative principles? I think first off, inviting collaboration. Management, human resources, unions, staff. It's a joint conversation. What do we need? What's actually going to work for us? This is not something that's designed and done onto staff. They need to be part of that discussion, because that's where we get the buy-in to the process and coming up with things that are real in different contexts. Now, the right process might be in different organisations that all of you sit in, I don't know the answer. But I can sit beside you and help ask the restorative questions and say, how is that going to meet people's needs? And I think once that becomes part of the organisation's DNA, all of you can do that as well. I think declaring a commitment to it and making a real commitment to doing this, and not something that comes up, you know, halfway through a process. Oh, do you want a restorative process? Because frankly, if someone offers me that, I'm going to feel fobbed off. You know, it doesn't feel like that's the organisation honestly engaging with my needs. It feels like they're trying to solve their problem at the moment, and this might be a neat way of doing it. So we need to have a kind of a transparent commitment to it. Legitimise it by including it as part of process options within the policy and procedure, which I've already talked to. Create processes with multiple transfer points rather than just the upward escalation. You know, very often people will deny things when something's first put to them. But actually, you know, accepting that sometimes once they've taken advice and they've thought about it and so on, and are assured of the safety of the process for them, often people will acknowledge their behaviour. I've yet to meet anyone that's acknowledged to being a bully. I have, when I've spoken to them, had a whole bunch of people acknowledging some pretty bad behaviours. Yeah, I did shout at them, I did do this, you know. So I think part of it is kind of some of the language we actually use in terms of getting people to engage. Distinguish a restorative approach from mediation, particularly that inclusion of others. And I'm not talking about, you know, getting the cast of Ben-Hur together. What I am saying is that who are the people that need to be involved in order for us to truly sort out this mess, rather than excluding all those people who often do know a bit of the thing, could be helpful in the process, and if they're excluded from the process, often will be doing the thing that human nature demands of all of us, which is to speculate and fill in the gaps. And there adds to this toxic sort of pit that we started with. Educate managers and staff about restorative processes and when they might be used. This shouldn't be a definitive list, but it's kind of getting people to an understanding of what this is about. Because I say, if it's done in a reactive sense, people are always going to feel fobbed off. It needs to be done in a proactive sense where it becomes part of the organisation. Now, clearly, leadership is a part of this. I'm not going to go through all of the slides that I was thinking about on this, but it is, you know, about being relationally focused, about being humble and empathetic, and thinking, I don't know all the answers to this, but actually, my team, my group of people here probably do. And I think one of the fundamental parts of a restorative process is saying, we've got the right people here to solve it. We don't necessarily need to go and get specialists to come in to sort this out for us. We can, all of us, survive in our normal lives outside of work quite happily, and yet in workplaces we treat people like children as if they've got no capacity to solve these problems for themselves. So I think some of the key roles for leaders, identifying tension and conflict. Rather than avoiding it, putting the head in the sand, is actually identifying that and naming it. Then being proactive instead of managing these, and being assertive in the need for something to happen. And being open to what that might be, but being said, this cannot stay the way it is. In my experience, the worst situations I've gone into, people have known. And often as long as 20 years, people have known that things have been sitting there simmering and have chosen for whatever reason not to do anything about it. Leaders need to be prepared to be involved in the resolution process themselves, including acknowledging their contribution to the dynamic, because usually they will have contributed as well. I'm not saying that they've got necessarily the biggest piece, usually they will have some piece of it. Yep, seek external support and assistance where necessary. I would just caution, I say this as I love the work, but frankly I think sometimes it's disempowering to always say, well, call in these specialists. I think to build organisational capability to resolve things, particularly at the lower level, that's the sign of a healthy organisation. And finally, I think as the leaders, assist in getting parties to the table. That's one of the most important things that I think leaders and managers can do, is encourage, support, cajole, but get people in that room. As a facilitator, I'm confident that we can make some progress once we get the right people in the room, and it's just getting them there that often is the biggest challenge. So just to close, a restorative approach is treating all people with respect, affirming, empowering, treating them fairly, recognising their capacities. That's a quote from Gabby Maxwell. I would hope that that sits with the value set of most of the organisations, and certainly perhaps slightly different words, but what I think one would hope for the public sector. And my final sort of little infomercial is to talk about the book Dignity. Who's read Dignity, by the way? Just raise a hand. Right, mass order, folks. You need to read a copy of Dignity. This was written by a woman called Donna Hicks from the Harvard team. She's worked in intercultural, intractable conflict all over the world. But her sort of thesis was around saying, in those intractable conflict where the substantive issues seem relatively minor, what caused them to get stuck so that they were apparently unsolvable? And what she worked out was it was about dignity. Yeah, where there had been some dignity violation. So when she, and just to pull back from that, when she's talking about dignity, people often say, oh, well, that's just respect. And she says, no. Respect is something we earn by dint of our passage through life, the things we do, the achievements we have, the actions we conduct. Dignity is something more deeper and more profound. It is a right. It's our right to be treated with human dignity. And I think being familiar with what those principles of dignity are and what the violations of dignity that frequently occur within organisation will help us to move on. And I think that's what a restorative process can offer. Frankly, this is something that can be transformational, but it's not an easy ticket. If you speak to any of the principals who have introduced restorative processes into schools and have really done that rather than just adopting a name, they'll tell you it's damned hard work, a lot harder work than just sitting with the existing, but the payoffs are huge. And so I think you need to enter into with that reality that this is not a sort of an easy fix. Thank you, folks. My apologies, I've run longer than I was anticipating, but I have got some time for questions. So what questions or observations or challenges? Yes?
Hi, I'm Gail Duncan. I'm just listening to you talking about the victim and the perpetrator's conflict. And I'm sure you mentioned, but it didn't come over very well, that the perpetrators also have some pressures put on them for them to be in the position you're in. I think of the level 4 and 5 managers at MPI, some of them have been, in that bullying case, and it's almost as if they've been organisationally taught or squashed into a position where they would act in their manner.
Yep.
So, in your program, is there something not just on the harms that have been done to them that might have been put them in the position in which they're acting?
Yeah. Thank you, and that's really good feedback for me, because that certainly wasn't the intention, but the point you've raised is important, and I would want to absolutely say, yes, you're absolutely right. And I think what I was alluding to there, and I've run through things very quickly, but in that whole systems view, what are the pressures on managers that are requiring them to deliver and squeeze their people to get whatever result they need to get? And so I think that's kind of part of when I say unpacking a situation, is to say who needs to be part of the conversation to really understand that. And so it will need to be people further up the chain, particularly if that's...
Restoration for the harmer as well as the person harmed.
Oh, yeah. No, absolutely. And I think, to move into a different context, a lot of the stuff we've looked at is things like sort of healthcare. And if something adverse outcomes in healthcare, we often go back to the practitioner, and they often get thrown up as this awful person. And they, frankly, go through an awful experience at that point. And we actually need to get past that to actually take that wider system view of saying, what are the pressures on them and what's it been like for them? So actually looking at that very much in a layered perspective. So thank you for the correction. Other questions? Yeah.
So I can relate to the restorative process because it would have been very helpful, because I was being bullied by someone at work, and my manager didn't want to do this. I alluded to it, and he tried the end on himself, which was later to fail. So from a restorative process, I recorded the bullying in my annual report, because I knew it was there forever. What is the recording of restorative process? Does that mean that if we have one, that myself as the person who was impacted and the person who was carrying it out, we both have recorded? How does that go? With paper, or how do we record this? Where does it go?
It's a very good question. I don't think there's a simple answer to it. And I think that's, for me, when I'm working in that space, it's about recording how we're going to, and negotiating how we're going to deal with that up front, and just being clear on what that's going to look like. What is the account back to the organisation around this? So just as a sort of, for instance, in the criminal system, when we've done a restorative process, a report goes back to the court, itemising what's happened there, what the undertakings might have been. Now, that's not necessarily always going to be the case in a workplace setting, but it is being clear in advance, and it's a really good question to be asking. How is the outcomes of this going to be recorded?
And where is it stored and for how long?
Exactly. So there are not a right answer, but I think it's where you need to get the policy and the processes internally organised. Because if we just do it on a sort of a one-off situation, then we're stumbling around in isolation. And it's where the likes of unions can actually get part of being involved in those discussions, saying, if we're running restorative processes, this is kind of the model that we're looking at, and this is how that narrative, that history will be recorded of what happened here.
And the people who are stakeholders involved in this restorative process, we had our round circle, we all get here, chat, we agree, different members of us agreed to, because we've been involved in it, to take accountability and that we're going to carry out this behaviour, we'll do this, we'll do that in the future. It's only contained within the circle. It doesn't flow out as a recording on your personal file, or it stays within that singular, whoever facilitates the meeting records it, and that's where it ends.
Yep.
Is that how it goes?
Well, again, I think it comes back to how we decide we're going to do that up front. So it's being clear before we start the process how it is going to be reported back. Yeah. And different contexts, different organisations will expect different things. Other questions? I saw a hand vaguely down there. Yes.
My name's Stevie Hallett. I'm from Corrections. What, in your experience, do people sometimes go for the restorative approach to avoid a punitive outcome? Because it seems like there's a risk that it could be used to kind of cover yourself or avoid actual disciplinary or investigative procedures.
Yeah. The reality is, and probably the cynicism of policing would tell me, yes, I'm sure that some people that have done this behaviour might look on it as a way out. But I think the point is, a process will only happen if the person's been harmed, has agreed to it, and understands what that, and is allowing them to make informed choices. Is this a process I want to get into? Now, as I said, sometimes someone that's been harmed may say, actually, I want this to be investigated, I want it to be formally done, and in which case that's the route it needs to go down.
I work with a sexual abuse prevention network, so I'm very intrigued in what you do. Work with young people at workplaces as well. In terms of the process involving inviting responsibility, I presume that so everyone in the room, but of those that are being harmed, I'm slightly concerned that there's could be a tendency towards victim blaming. Why didn't you speak up? Why didn't you do this?
Yep.
You're responsible for the position you're in.
Yeah, and that comes back to my point about preparation. As a facilitator, I'm not just chucking people into a room. I need to be clear in advance, where people are sitting. Are they already, I'm not just hoping they'll be accountable when they get in there. We've got to a point and we've made some clear what the expectations are around the process. So, yeah, it's very definitely not just a whack them in the room and hope they'll be front up.
Do you have any data or case studies about how this has been applied within workplaces and the results?
Data of that sort is quite difficult to get because often there's certainly a level of privacy and confidentiality around that. But we did, this is my own company, did a bunch of work around safety in the electricity industry and based on restorative principles, and we did that over 5 years. And the organisations, and those stories are publicly available, so I'll send a link for that. Those organisations that truly engaged in that, particularly from a leadership perspective, had huge results, and particularly in really direct results in terms of their own productivity. That where you actually engage your staff talking about, and this was physical sort of health and safety things across their industry, actually the results change and we became a bit more efficient because you're starting to, you're getting the smell of the front line, where the people who are actually doing the work are saying, these are the issues, these are the problems, these are the challenges we're facing, and we can help you solve those problems. So, yeah, so that's probably not a full answer to what you said, but I think we're slowly kind of starting to pick that together, but it would be great to get some more case studies. Yeah.
And just a follow-up thought from the question. Have you seen a crossover, particularly in perhaps the subject of safety or in an industry setting like electrical, where organisations that may have already embraced something like Kaizen, lean problem solving, approach to their work, find restorative justice just an extension of problem solving in the workplace in terms of how work is, because some of the principles that seem to be a carbon copy.
Yep. Certainly some of the electricity industry where Kaizen is certainly one of the approaches that's been taken by them, and certainly those that were already doing Kaizen, it was much easier to get to the next level around that, and so they were probably able to make the sort of the greatest inroads most quickly.
Yeah. And on the flip side of that, if an organisation wasn't using any of that sort of problem solving, error proofing kind of approach, so that, how can we prevent this from happening in the future, then it could be an opportunity to add that into the workplace if people get the hang of this and apply it in a wider sense on how work is done.
Absolutely, and we've certainly seen that. It was interesting, some of the organisations we went into, we ran a sort of a survey process and then a bunch of sort of feedback workshops and then a meeting with the CEO and their direct team with staff reps. Now, sometimes we had all sorts of promises coming out of the first session. We'd go back 6 months later, run the process again, and people say it's worse than it ever was now, and partly because expectations had come out and nothing had changed. And sometimes it took 2 or 3 to actually get to the point where there was a kind of a click that went on with, you mean we've got to do something differently? And you say, yeah. And at some point that ticks, and often it's about then engaging staff and getting them to engage in, do we go Kaizen or do we go some other particular sort of agile or whichever way we're going to head. But that's when they really started getting some traction. So it's fundamentally changing the nature of management and leadership as well, which is why I think the leadership piece sits there.
So my thoughts were quite similar to the fellow back there in terms of if not done right, you could easily have a situation where the people affected blame themselves for an hour and then the other people don't take responsibility. In terms of getting an appropriate mediator, have you got suggestions on just like making sure that they are going to handle it well and they're not just say, oh yeah, I can totally handle that, and then they just park everyone on their own?
Yeah, I mean, I think you, at the moment we're having a conversation at the moment across government around how we build that capacity and capability. We can certainly help point you towards, certainly someone that's accredited as a mediator, I think is important. There are a bunch of criminal restorative justice facilitators out there. I don't know that you can assume just because they've been doing that criminal work that they're necessarily, you could slot them into a workplace.
Yeah.
If they've not done that type of workplace type mediation before.
So sort of maybe questions you can ask to see if someone is familiar with the process.
I'd be asking about, where they've worked before, what's the level of training and accreditation that they've had, and whether that's accreditation through one of the mediation organisations, AMINS or Resolution Institute or whatever.
Before we lose everyone, it might be a good time to wind this up. And I'd like to thank John very much for his insight and his really interesting session. And I'm sure that you're available for people to follow up either straight after this or if people want to contact you at Victoria.
Yep.
So I'd like to show our appreciation to John for